So, in the spirit of alacrity, I'll introduce Professor Tilton. Lauren Tilton is the E. Claiborne Robbins Professor of Liberal Arts and Digital Humanities at the University of Richmond in Virginia. Her research focuses on analyzing, developing, and applying digital and computational methods to the study of 20th and 21st century documentary expression and visual culture. She has several books and many publications, and has received a great deal of support from various foundations, not least including a collaboration with David Baman and a Schmidt-funded what is it called? Humanities AI Virtual Institute project looking at motion pictures and television things. As with all of these talks, they're being recorded, and without too much further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Tilton, who is speed running her slides as we speak. That's it. Thank you very much. Are you ready, Mark?
Let's just check an audio and video.
Great. Okay.
Excellent. Speed run. Okay, that's it, y'all. That was great. Okay, excellent. Talk in 5 seconds. Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks. How's everyone doing? Okay, we're good? Hanging in there? A little cooler room today? Yeah? Okay, awesome. Well, thanks all for joining, and I want to thank the entire team for organizing for this wonderful week-long event with on cultural analytics and multimodal. So just want to appreciate all the work of everyone who's organized, including the wonderful people who take care of these buildings and the entire teams at the UC systems. So thank y'all. Today is a little bit of some work that is proposing this idea of multimodal cinemetrics. I don't know if it works. I might need a different term. It may not. And so it's a provocation, a debate, a conversation. This is where we're some newer work based on a current book project that Taylor and I are working on, and he will be presenting some more of the computational results at the end in his talk. So these are kind of connected conversations that are part of it. So just a little bit of a frame for what we're doing. So we work on thinking about computational methods for the analysis of visual culture. And ways that we can think through, particularly understanding 20th and 21st century US visual culture. My training is in American Studies, kind of in visual culture analysis. So that is the background under which I bring to this equation as we think through the ways that we can bring these fields together. And one of the reasons we got to the interest in time-based media has to do with several pieces. One is a return, actually, to work that I've never published, which was my dissertation. And my dissertation was on documentary filmmaking in the 1960s and 1970s, and actually youth film workshops across the United States as an effort to liberate the camera from the Hollywood system and to offer the control over the means of representation to communities across the U.S. who were being represented, but not on their terms. And so we got interested in some earlier work about how might we be able to think about computational methods for these kind of documentary films and forms. Turned out that's really, really, really hard. These are kind of amateur filmmakers. I want to highlight this new book that came out called Doing Digital Film History. Our article in it called Distant Viewing the Amateur Film Platform is basically an entire article about how it didn't work and the challenges ahead for very, very complex filmmaking that is done without the sort of formal training of directorial systems, institutions of higher ed, and other elements. So that led us to kind of scale back our ambitions a little bit about large-scale analysis of television and film, to start thinking about some forms that had a bit more control variables, if you were, which led us to the sitcom. And Taylor's going to talk a lot more about that analysis when we get to it, for his part and some of the things we've been working on. But all of these pieces have kind of led to a series of guiding questions that are guiding the work that I'm talking today about, which is basically, what are the units of analysis for the study of time-based media? What should we be actually doing? What is the question we should be doing computationally? And how does that impact what we're able to learn, the ways of knowing that we can actually garner from computational insights in conversation with archives, formal theories, theoretical frames as well. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about our efforts to try to start putting these different theories and pieces together, where some of the computational methods are, some of the questions we're having about what do we even compute if we're doing cultural analytics? What is the unit of analysis? And then might we be able to start thinking of this as something called multimodal cinemetrics, drawing on the genealogy of computation in film and of time-based media. You will notice I'm using the term time-based media, not just TV or film. That is a politics and a frame to that, because one of the things we're trying to think through is how different are different types of time-based media, and how much do we need to account for them. For those familiar with media studies or the cutting edge of media studies, you'll know that kind of merger or convergence of forms is happening in that literature and that scholarship as people think across some of the boundaries that were thought of with media forms, and you as a part of that effort. Okay. So a little bit about film and TV theory that's guiding our work. So here are some thoughts as we think about what do we even study or how do we study. So for those familiar with film theory, some early work thinks about work such as Sergei Eisenstein, who offered us ideas such as film editing as a key concept. So these are historical ideas as we think we encode them into computational methods. He had ideas of how might we be doing film editing. He offered ideas such as metric, rhythm, tone, as elements that we want. And his sort of element was that filmmaking comes from a point, or should be from a point of agitation. It should disrupt the viewer in certain ways. And it should be a conflict. Film should produce conflict of some way. On the other side, you have theorists like Podolkin, who I can never pronounce correctly, who said actually that we're built, that the shot, the film is not just shot, but it's built. It's a built of separate pieces of celluloid put together that move into areas such as concepts such as the close-up, the mid-shot, and the long shot. So in the 20s and 30s, start introducing these ideas of the close-up and the long shot as elements that we have control over or have some sort of narrative structure or form that they can provide. And he was less into the disjuncture of film, but into the continuity that film could create. A sense of storytelling that didn't disrupt the viewer, but kind of carried them through a story. Think of this on our more contemporary moment. The Hollywood machine is not a film store, is not a production mode of disruption usually. It would be more on the continuity side of that equation. Then we get the idea of pace. So pace gets theorized earlier on too as a main idea that we might want to be thinking of. Griffith, who's kind of the key to the rise of cinema and the rise of the long form fiction film. As X says, that pace is sort of the kind of the piece of the director's art. So now we get this idea of the emerging of the auteur, the idea of the artist, the director as auteur, as the key element of as the sort of the big mind behind the film. We then started to see work that comes out of semiotics, where there were other theories of how film worked, such as Christian Metz. Christian Metz is kind of famously for saying that film is not like language. We can't just call it like a word and sentences. We can't just model the idea of the written word, like of linguistics, straight on to the idea of filmmaking and meaning. And those familiar with media studies will know that these are core arguments about the difference between mediums. right? That film, images, and other forms actually make meaning in different ways, and we need to account for that. Right now, we don't have a computational analysis of syntagma, but could we, or would we, and what would that mean? As we get to more contemporary theory, we have ideas like David Bordwell, who's been one of the most influential thinkers in this space, who starts to theorize ideas of narration, ideas of the plot versus the way the viewer is constructed, such as Suzette and Fabola. And these sort of ideas are also a part of the key of saying that style is not just decoration, that film style is super important to the form. So sometimes people will say, well, why are we just studying film styles and not just sort of the aesthetics of it? No, I would argue that this is actually really fundamental to the way the form communicates and the messages it makes, and that those are actually encoded cultural messages that are sitting in those decisions that become key to the ways we decode film or decode time-based media. On the TV side, we have a sort of different set of theories that we're trying to think through how might we put in conversation or think together when we think about large-scale analysis of TV and film. One is idea of Raymond Williams being a central cultural figure in this equation, where he came up with the idea of flow. Flow being that we need to think beyond the cut or the shot or the scene or even the sequence in television, the sequence being maybe a potential set of scenes, but the flow of the entire show or the entire show across the broadcast apparatus. So as I move from segment to commercial to segment to commercial segment, that there's a flow that we should be thinking about as a way of actually cutting the units of analysis for television. Others include John Ellis, who actually disagrees with Williams and says, actually, no, I actually think segments are a good idea. I think they should be the meaningful unit of analysis, and how might we be able to do that? And particularly thinking about the changes in broadcast TV mechanisms. Perhaps the most famous theorist that often gets misquoted is Marshall McLuhan. He has arguments about cool and hot mediums. And he actually just says the medium is the message. He's actually not really interested in the content itself. He's interested in the way that the medium is influencing changes. And in any ways, he kind of anticipates Haraway and ideas of the prosthetic. He anticipates that move where we have an apparatus attached to us that has some sort of changes our social relations to the body and to the person. Often people use medium as the message to say the content of the medium is the message. Not the message. The medium is literally the technology of the message. That is actually what he's concerned about. I would like to say that as a pet peeve. It's one of those often misquoted quotes, I think, in media studies and from the area. I see a few laughs, so I'm assuming there might be some inner, yeah. Oh, it was on too. Sorry about that. Okay, so the medium is the message as well. Both of those things. And the extensions of man. If you want a wonderful critique of this idea of the extensions of man, I recommend reading the work of Armand Towns, who has done some of the best work on the most cutting edge work on Marshall McLuhan and his new book that's out in California. Another theorist of this is televisuality. Caldwell sits around if you're doing television, where he's thinking about the shift of style as we move from a sort of formulaic model of the sort of rhythms of the network era into what he calls the perform and flaunt excessive visual style, which really brings in a whole new set of different genres that begin to define television, what he calls boutique, tabloid, trash TV. Personally, I love trash TV. If anyone would like to talk about trash TV, I think it's actually trash TV. Think of this as the rise of what some would say are like the reality TV shows, which I think might be actually the most important development in television in the last 20 years. And actually film of time-based media because of its deep influential shifts on the way it gets deployed culturally. Kardashians, number one example, right? People like in those areas. So, and he starts to think about ideas of he's concerned that the ideas of TV are shifting. We then have ideas of cinematic TV that emerge so what we're seeing here is a convergence. As TV becomes As we get the dispersion of networks, we start the rise of HBO, we start the rise eventually with the streaming. TV is becoming more cinematic, more like film. And people are trying to figure out what does it mean as TV becomes more cinematic? What is that? Is that a different style? Is it not? What are the conditions of that? And they come up with different genres. And one of the reasons I bring these up is because even the ways we talk about genre when we categorize the analysis of TV computationally doesn't account for any of these ways of thinking about TV. People talk about comedy, they talk about procedural, but there's almost none of the data that we use when we work at TV thinks about these categories of prestige, cinematic, and the debates that are historical to those elements as well. Another is Jeremy Butler's work, who's probably the foremost of theorizing television style. And he gets really interested in the editing of it and the mood that these can come. And we're going to come back to Butler in a minute. As well as Jason Mattel, who theorizes the idea of complex TV, that there's a narrative complexity that's being developed into the shows, basically aligning with many of the complexities that we see in cinema or we see in filmmaking. As he says, many of the ways that cinema and film is made is being transitioning into the rise of TV. And if you're into the real debates, he's got a fun back and forth with Kristen Thompson about art TV. Okay, so that's sort of these two worlds of film and television that are theorizing, thinking of different units of analysis, from different genres, and thinking about them in very different ways. Some of them with representing their historical moment, and some trying to synthesize different histories of it. So another is how have researchers then approached this numeric analysis. And we've seen this rise of quantification of film, of time-based media that becomes an element. I want to note that one of the things I think is a slight misnomer, which is coming out of this earlier focus on the director, which I think also emerges out of this idea of kind of great thinkers, the great genius, is that women were often the big editors behind these shows. There's a whole new set of history coming out about film and TV, that women were key editors and much more a part of the equation than they have been given credit for. And that the editing floor, if we say that the cut and the shot are the building blocks, then there's a story maybe sitting behind some of these about a more complex story about who's shaping style and who's shaping the films. And also a long history of quantification in TV and time-based media. So we got some initial work that I think really formative is Barry Salt in this equation, who starts to actually think about multimodality very early on. While a lot of work has focused on average shot length or shot scale. And for shot scale, that for them is a close-up, long shot, medium shot, and those get more and more granular as theory develops over time. He's also starting to think about elements such as the J and the L shot. This is where audio and the cut may merge or break apart, where the audio might continue, but there's a visual cut, or there's a break, audio cut, and the visual returns, right? There's different relations of those. The timing and pacing of those is going to shift as across the show. And this is a little bit more about that kind of piece of it. Interestingly, the Cinemetrics group, when they took this up, building off of Barry Salt in the 90s, really didn't they kind of dropped the multimodal side of this. They just went for average shot length and median shot length. So basically, this is about basically this is a proxy for, they're arguing is a proxy for pacing of the show of a movie or of a movie. Often these get used in the arguments about attention, like people have shows gotten longer, have they gotten, are cuts longer, are they shorter? And they created a tool called Cinemetrics, a very early, what they would, I think, also call a digital humanities project that was really important. And they were, again, focused on director style, these pacing over time, and the focus on the shot and the cut as a fundamental building block. So they went back to the shot cut model, and that was kind of their primary focus. On the other hand, we had Jeremy Butler, who took the computational term of TV. He appropriated the ASL, MSL model for this, also looking at those formulas and looking at cutting rates and modes. But he also tried to introduce back to some multimodality, thinking about the laugh track and how the laughing might be a part of the equation. If anyone's figured out laugh tracks, let us know. We cannot. It is actually incredibly hard to develop laugh tracks. And it seems like it should be easier than it is, which is a foundational way of thinking about any comedy or certain TV shows. Another work that this also particularly often gets overlooked is the work of Charles O'Brien, who actually also has been doing some multimodal work to look at the rise of silent and sound with the rise of the talkies and looking at how those. So this is some initial work now to actually start putting together the elements. And I think he has an interesting metric. He calls them action shots, dialogue shots, and singing shots, which is another metric for thinking through these elements. Well, shameless plug for our own work, where we've been thinking about how to theorize distant viewing, large-scale analysis of images using machine learning techniques. Almost everything I've shown you to this point has been hand-counted. Someone sitting there with like a phone, but actually it would have been a stopwatch. Doing that. And some of our work was to try to think if we could do this at scale over large television, and we kind of stuck with some of the two-shot group shots pieces as well. And of course, the team here, David Bama's team, I know Kent's been working in this space now to think through it, as others in this space. We've seen some great talks about that. But theorizing annotations and that way, and Peter's work over Broadwell on theater. By the way, if you go to our website, Distant Viewing Explorer, a lot of the methods that we talk about are available in there. That is a GUI interface that you can actually analyze your own film, your own TV and images to start to get a sense of how these methods work. It's funded by the Mellon Foundation. So therefore, if we have this whole ecosystem, part of what we're thinking through is how do we start to put this together? We have all these much more diverse units of analysis. We have all these different theoretical frames. What are some ways we can actually start to do this? And again, this is a talk that has more questions than answers. Taylor's going to talk a little bit more about power, making some of those decisions in our TV shows. But one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about recently is even something as challenging as what is a shot? Seemingly the most basic element of a time-based medium. And one of the challenges is that it gets used in many different ways when people talk about the scholarship. A shot can be a length of time. A shot can be the shot type of closeness, and shot can be scale for the film. If you like film textbooks, and they can also be categorized in these different ways. And there's not a shared vocabulary, and analysis happens in all these different spaces. So let's give you an example of. I'm going to ask you now to thinking about whether it's a close-up, a long shot. Usually when we do analysis, we say, this is one shot, here's a time, and it has a close-up or a long shot, and you do 1-to-1. I want to think about the shot type for this next shot, which is one of the most famous scenes from a Hitchcock's Notorious. Give it a second.
It's not that I don't trust you. When you're in love, my age, every man who looks at a woman is a menace. Forgive me for even talking about it.
Yeah, it's going to go really slow, okay, because our Wi-Fi is slow. This is always the risk. Let's see if it'll pick up. Wi-Fi. What, Jerome? No! Okay, she's holding a key. She's hiding it from him. The context is she's trying to hide the key so they can feel. Anyway, let's see. Okay. And so then she hides it. Okay, but this is the shot that is among the most famous, where, well, doesn't matter. Basically, what happens? Let's see if I should have a local copy. Hold on. Let's try it from here.
It's not that I don't trust. Just when you're in love at my age, every man who looks at a woman is a menace. Give freedom talking.
Maybe.
Very contrived.
Okay, well, audio is less important. Let's just pay attention to the shot. So she's hit the man. So this is a shot. how would we classify this if we're gonna say what kind of shot type it is? Looks like a long shot. Extreme long shot, long shot.
So are you not capturing lens movement?
Are we capturing lens movement?
Are you not when you're categorizing these? Because this is very clearly a zoom from extreme long to pretty extreme close up. So you start.
Well, yeah, we're not hitting.
So you aren't starting at one point and having that.
We're not doing that right now.
I think we might join the rest of the party.
So you go from a long shot to a close up, extreme close up in that shot. And so part of the challenge becomes how do you categorize that when you have that element? And when a lot of the ways that categorization has happened is people tend to pick one description.
I don't trust you.
Hold on.
Every man who looks at you, woman.
Where is that coming from?
You may have joined computer audio.
Okay, there we go. So there's a lag. Okay. We're just gonna skip to the stop it. Don't worry about this yet. Okay. So one of the things that's happening is a lot of the work in computational work ends up having to categorize the shot by a single feature. Is it a close-up? Is it a long shot? So even as we're starting to think about how do we do these units of analysis, how do we start to capture the complexities in even about 15 seconds of going from an extreme to a close-up, extreme long shot to an extreme close-up, which adds levels of complexity about how we think about these. So one of the things we're starting to do is to think about how we can start to think of some different ways to capture some of these elements in the film. The other shot I was going to show you is a cut from rope, where visually you can't actually tell there was a cut. So it's a shot where it turns and the camera zooms in on the person's back, and then it turns back the back. And if you know from the editing of the show, if you read about it, there is a cut, but visually it shows no cut. The whole movie is only eight shots. So what do you do when you have that kind of range as well and start to think of that computationally? The last one I was going to show you is from which is Godard, which is jump cuts, where you're watching her in a car and it jump cuts, and and the audio is asynchronous. So they recorded all the audio after, except for the final 2-3 seconds where the audio realigns. And so we have all of these like complexities that are key to the show. And we can think of the jump cut, where basically the jump cut's like, think about taking like 2 seconds of the film out and cutting it back in. It's like taking a few seconds out and going. We could think of that as sort of more in line with the just juncture of someone like Einstein versus the continuity of, say, Pudovkin, right, as elements. So things we're starting to think about is how might we think of some schemas or ways to do this computationally that start to capture some of these complexities that can start to pay attention to some of the lack of clarity of language and the way we're doing this. So for example, one example is something like, instead of saying close-up, extreme close-up, medium, and categorizing, how might we think about the vantage of the camera instead? How might we think about that vantage point? Instead of just single frames, how we might think, we might think of tracking shots and the different kinds of shots. Maybe we think of it as something like a traverse, to kind of categorize on a broader scale the way the camera's moving. Other ones we thinking of is, instead of calling a scene, because it's really hard to do, we're thinking about something like passage. Is it a passage through the film in other ways? And others like lemon, which is like where the figure is moving toward or away from the camera, that kind of interstitial space as we're moving. And if we can think about some of those different ways of categorizing, might they open up ways of thinking about the films as well? Because in some ways, it's been really naturalized to call things like a cut or a shot, but actually now we don't even cut film. So there's also a material shift that's happening as well as we think about the new semantics or semiotics of time-based media. And this is to talk a little bit about sound. This is a show, this doesn't matter that it's breaking up because the sound's not aligned anyway. But the sounds don't align with the shot. And what do we do with that where the person talking and the way they're talking doesn't fit inside the shot at all? And starting to think about some of these other ways we might be thinking through sound, like an L cut or the J cut I mentioned earlier, diegetic, non, or how we can think about some of these disjointness of the shows, of these movies, and as we move into TV. Okay, so final piece here I'm going to talk a little bit about is what is cinema, to what degree is it distinct as we're thinking about kind of a multimodal approaches to film and television. I want to note that our work is primarily based on a North American, global North framework. So this is within that. And actually the film scholarship and theory we're working on is coming from that. There are decolonial film theories and ideas that frame the way that films made in, say, Southeast Asia or other South America are made. So ours is definitely through the American studies lens of a sort of a transnational Americas apparatus. So what is cinema? To what degree is it distinct from other media, and why does that matter? So a provocation, can we recover the word cinemetrics in a new way? I don't know if this works. So we could debate or find other words. But one of the things what I think is important is particularly as we're thinking about cultural analytics and other forms is finding language or words or theories or terms that reflect the cultural, historical, and computational relations and embeddedness that we want inside, that we want to be accountable to. So I don't want to be accountable only to the language produced by Adobe video editors. I don't want to be accountable only to how do we actually create theories or ideas that reflect the kind of humanistic ideas or positionalities that are sitting underneath our approaches to computational methods. So one idea is to think about multimodal cinemetrics. So what is cinema? Well, cinema is a term that actually comes from just meaning movement. That's the origin of the word, or basically motion. And it got taken in the 1890s under when it was coined by the Lumiere brothers, cinematography. And it then got shortened to cinema to meet in the movie hall. A cinema, again, became associated with a physical space. But we're seeing that change right now. If you go on streaming sites like Canopy, they will say they're curating a collection of classic cinema or all trending movies and TV. And so we're seeing the word cinema moving in real time now. No one goes to the cinema anymore, right? They do, but they go to the theater. We don't say we go, that's a particular, so the cinema, we're seeing the streaming platforms, we're seeing the way that the mediums, the message of the mediums is shifting shifting the names, the word cinema in real time right now. It's a changing keyword. If you want to draw back on Raymond Williams and ideas of keywords and changing cultural meanings of words as they evolve, as they change over time. And so as these distinctions become less and less clear, and in fact, arguably were never as clear as sometimes they've been stated, much of film comes from early film comes from vaudeville, it comes from plays, it comes from theater. I'm thinking of the amazing work of Peter Broadwell and their Schmidt Sciences team connecting the history of theater and dance. And we're interested in how we could connect that to histories of early cinema, where we think about Le Bon movement or other movement styles that make their way across mediums. We also have the TV plays, or what they're called in Britain, when they even have the rise of television. And then we have genres like the anthology drama that has never been unique to TV or film. We have anthology dramas in radio, TV, film, and video games. So genre mixes get mixed across. And as we are seeing a really different industrial conditions of TV and film now as shows merge. So we can think of the rise of the miniseries on Netflix, where they're sort of like 3-hour, 4-hour films that have basically been cut up into elements with the rise of the sort of mini series. which was also has a history in television where you would have sort of miniseries specials. This is very true of documentary, by the way. This is where documentary films have been made out of CBS News report shows that were actually showing documentaries as a TV show, as a news report. You went to the cinema in the early 20th century to watch newsreels to get your news. So that longer history, it got even more and more converged as we've gotten into the rise of streaming. And we're even seeing film shows, like you could think of something like Wicked, where it's a play that got split into 2 movies cut in half and then got segmented out, right? Or the splitting of something like Emily in Paris or Bridgerton, where they released half of it so you could binge watch 3 hours, and they're going to release the second half and binge watch it like a movie, right? And the actual algorithmic mechanisms of YouTube and Netflix are designed to make you not stop. You basically have a brief pause and you keep going. So even the algorithms are trying to make you have a more never give up in the way that a film in the cinema would do. There were breaks in cinema, by the way. Gone with the Wind's one of the most famous. There was part, stop, redid. There's all kinds of histories of movies as well having pauses in them. Just in the way that early movies, people yelled at the screen. We didn't always used to be quiet. It was actually quite raucous to go to the movies in the 1920s. So the idea of a talk back, even while you're streaming, while watching someone else streaming, it has lineages in a participatory cinematic or participatory experience. So as we're thinking about that, this is a moment where we can start to think about these questions. Could we start to blend and merge these theories? Could we draw on them in ways we haven't yet? Might we be historically precise when we do them? When I'm talking about film from the early 20th century, if pacing is a really important concept, or if I'm talking about a concept from now that wasn't an important idea when the film was made, do I apply that or do I not? How do we start to think about these numeric units that we're doing, and what other ways are the ways that the media production today, the way they're being produced, sort of collapsing a lot of the boundaries that the infrastructure of TVs and movies has in our current moment, and what are the implications for that for our numeric work? So some things we're looking at now to think through them is style and authorship, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. Thinking about the TV film boundary, how much are they that? How bounded are they? How might we be able to start looking at tropes or metaphors or echoes that happen across form that are influencing each other historically? Where's the role of diegetic and non-diegetic sound? How does that change? One thing that's less studied is people do talk a lot about how the visuals have changed with the screen, but actually we also audio changes as well deeply as with the rise of different viewing apparatuses. Also the representation, who gets represented, who doesn't on these things, and other formal conventions as the change, as we put these pieces together in new ways. And again, this is more theoretical piece of this, but Taylor will be talking a little bit more about that in a minute. So how we're actually putting that together. So this is research in action. We're in the middle of it. This is where we're at, and welcome feedback, thoughts, and seeing people like Kit Chang's great work building on this, Peter Leonard's as well, and I know Miguel's great work as well, and so many others. So as we think about where do we go from here, and a shameless plug for the ACH and the USDH Association's conference, which will be online. If you're interested in seeing more about what's happening in digital humanities, joining us in Korea for DH26. And if you're interested in open access publishing, computational humanities research for cultural analytics work as well. So shameless plug. Okay, thanks.